All right. Well, thank you all for coming. It's a real joy to be here. And I want to thank Dietrich for the warm welcome to Atlanta, and to Leslie for all of the incredible support. And of course, all of you again for coming. So there's a wide range of expertise and many disciplines represented in this room, I have to imagine. And while this talk is going to get technical, talking about some of the empirical work going on in cumulative culture, I'm tempted to pitch it in a way I hope that will be accessible and interesting to all. Originally, I pitched it a little bit more basically. I was expecting some high school students to come. Unfortunately, they didn't make it, so I might pump up the technical sophistication in some parts. But I want to begin with a story. This is a story that's collected in John Bennett and Susan Rowley's really magisterial book, Ukularia, an oral history of Nunavut. And it goes as follows, quote, "There was a man that made his home near Sanarajak. He had a kayak that was wider than normal. This kayak was thus more stable and would not tip over. It said that when the bowhead whales were numerous, he would plan on catching one. When a strong wind started to blow from the southwest, he pushed off. He went alone because the rest of us could not handle the waves that he would have to go through. The wind was now blowing from the sea to the land. He was gone for some time, and he finally returned after the waves had really started to roll. When he landed, he was helped with all the necessary chores. Then the people noticed that his harpoon lines and float were not on his kayak. As it turned out, he'd killed a bowhead while he was out. He knew that the dead whale would be blown towards the direction of the land," end quote. So blowhead whales are an enormous mammal. That this man could hunt, kill, and have the whale blow in for dinner is an incredibly impressive feat. Indeed, the storyteller tells us, quote, "It is said he was a very able man, and no one ever equaled his ability," end quote. As many of this group will know, the indigenous populations living in the circumpolar regions of the globe continue to survive and thrive in incredibly challenging circumstances, where resources continue to be highly seasonal, geographically disparate, and frequently dangerous to secure. Their historical occupation and stewardship of these territories over thousands of years relies upon ingenious and highly sophisticated cold adaptive clothing, forms of transportation, kinship structures, and hunting tools. These technologies have long impressed those working in cultural evolution. This is especially so for the brand of cultural evolution that emerged in the 1980s out of the work of people like Rob Boyd, Pete Richardson, Luca Luigi Cavalli-Sforza, and Mark Feldman. These researchers were impressed by the way in which culture, typically understood as the transmission of information through social learning, could generate adaptations on par with those of biological adaptations. As these researchers saw it, institutions, technologies were culminations of long histories of cultural evolutionary change. So as Boyd, Richardson, and their student, former Emory professor Joe Henrich noted in 2013, the tools essential for life in even the simplest foraging societies are typically beyond the inventive capacities of individuals. Instead, they evolve, gradually accumulating complexity through the aggregate efforts of populations of individuals, typically over many generations. People don't invent complex tools, populations do. Statements like these, emphasizing the collective enterprise of cultural evolution, became the foundation of research on what would come to be called in the 1980s and 1990s cumulative culture. And cumulative culture is my target today. Before I dig into that concept, let me just say a couple words about cultural evolution in general. So depending on where you're coming from, your disciplinary background, you might associate that phrase with different thinkers, maybe Herbert Spencer and Lewis Henry Morgan, the Marxist accounts of, say, Leslie White, or the cultural typologies of Julian Stewart. But none of these are captured particularly well by how the phrase is used today. The kind of cultural evolution at stake here has its roots in models drawn from population genetics and phylogenetics. But from these roots have sprung a tree with many branches. Right? So we see on the slide a couple of the approaches. So these sort of experimental psychology experiments from Christine Caldwell, and these other kinds of formal mathematical models from Oren Kolodny. Cultural evolution is now an interdisciplinary and methodologically rich area of research, combining a wide range of evidentiary sources. And cumulative culture is big business in cultural evolution. In this field, it's increasingly been seen as a distinctively human phenomenon. Humans, but not other animals, have the capacities that support the social transmission of traits in ways that modifications made to those traits can be retained over time. Let me just say a little bit more about that. So cumulative cultural traits are traits with histories, things we might also call traditions. Though there are some complications we could make to that simple articulation, we can say that cumulative culture exists when traits can be transmitted from individual to individual, such that modifications made can be retained over time. So lots of things get a count as cumulative cultural traditions on this definition. So particular pieces of technology, component elements of language, and societal institutions. The key product of cumulative culture, as Alex Masudi notes, are, quote, cultural traits that have become too complex for any single individual to invent in their lifetime. If we think traditions can accumulate changes, they might gradually accumulate more and more complex structure. If this is so, then such traits might reach a point that no naive individual would be able to reinvent that sort of latest trait in that tradition from scratch. To get an example, we might go back to some of the tools found among the Inuit in what is now Nunavut. Consider the key ocean-going vessel, the kayak. Felix Alerlak outlines the processes and materials out of which such kayaks were made. Quote, skins from basking seals caught in the spring were used to cover the kayak. When the time came to cover the frame with skins, they would be slightly aged. Of course, when there were not enough skins to cover the kayak, they would have to make do with skin from a recently killed seal. Aged sealskin was preferred as the hair could be peeled right off the skin. With the fresh skin, they had to scrape the hair off. Scrape skins, it is said, create too much drag when one is trying to approach an animal, producing a sound of friction as the kayak skims along the surface, end quote. A naive individual popped into the circumpolar regions of what is now Canada would be hard-pressed to re-innovate all of the technologies and tools of the Inuit in their lifetime, let alone discover the important differences between aged and new seal skins when creating them. In fact, this idea of a naive explorer with just their wits and their moxie is a favorite trope of cultural evolutionary researchers who describe numerous situations where European explorers end up dying or diseased while being surrounded by plenty, basically. What these explorers lacked was not individual intelligence, but the wisdom and intelligence embodied in cultural traditions and technologies. The importance of cultural evolution, and particularly cumulative cultural evolution, is thus taken to have really central evolutionary importance. As Joe Henrich sees it, cumulative culture is a signal of when early hominins crossed the Rubicon, moving from a period of time when human evolution was dominated by biological change to one dominated by cultural change and cultural forces. Because cumulative culture is supposed to distinguish humans from non-humans, to explain our geographic spread, it's thus an incredibly important and compelling research target. But many researchers have been pushing back on some elements of this picture. To articulate these critical perspectives, I'm going to be switching from talking about cumulative culture as something that we just find out there in the world to talk about the concept of cumulative culture. So how it's used as a scientific concept by scientists and researchers. These critiques in general have tended to suggest that the cumulative culture concept is what we philosophers would say lumped, that it needs to be, again, philosophical jargon, split. These terms, lumping and splitting, are used in philosophy to describe both scientific attitudes. So there's lumpers and splitters. This, for instance, is a phylogeny of different ancient hominin species that includes the possibility of species evolving out of one another. So anagenesis leads to a pretty lumped phylogeny. So there can be sort of scientific attitudes of lumping and splitting, but there can also be concepts that are lumped and split. And when we talk about a concept being lumped, it's one that contains multiple elements that should be kept apart. And the reason why they should be kept apart or when people make arguments that they should be, is that doing so helps to produce various kinds of goods, better explanations, more powerful models, and more precise experimental controls. So let me outline a few preliminary distinctions before I get into some of the arguments of these splitters. So the cumulative culture concept tends to be used pretty loosely in cultural evolution. It tends to, be applied in a lot of places where we see change in culture. But I think we can break it down pretty uncontroversially into claims about 4 different kinds of things. These are, first, specific psychological capacities. Second, the processes involved in generating cumulative cultural change. Third, interesting patterns that we might see in the cultural evolutionary record. And fourth, specific products of these processes, some of which can be used as signals for detecting cumulative culture. And we can fit into this scheme the claims that we've just seen from Boyd, Henrich, and others. On this picture, the specific psychological capacities are generally taken to be imitation or perhaps copying. The processes involved are these ones I've spoken about: modification, social transmission, retention. The interesting patterns are increases in complexity and maybe adaptiveness, right? These are the wisdom that allows populations to survive. And the products of particular interest are those that are too complex for any one individual to have invented on their own. Now, what splitters argue is that the elements in this schema are lumped, encompassing entities, processes, and features that should be kept separate. I see 2 broad kinds of splitting arguments in the literature today. And the first one should be no surprise to anyone here. It's been spearheaded by researchers in comparative cognition who point to the surprising capacities of animals. What these researchers emphasize is the way in which the scheme, this kind of scheme, in particular the capacities of imitation and copying, seems to unfairly rule out finding cumulative culture in animals. Nonetheless, there seem to be really plausible instances of cumulative culture in animals. Just to give a few examples, the most famous, of course, are the various tools used by chimps. So these include toolkits of modified sticks used to dig for honey, modified branches used to dip for termites, cracking nuts with various stones, and showing some capacity for collective innovation. Another has to do with the really impressive tool-making capacities of New Caledonian crows. So the image in the bottom right shows a New Caledonian crow with a branch, but they are also known to manufacture their own tools by sort of snipping, ripping these sort of grubbing tools out of pandan leaves. And though there's some work that puts this under scrutiny, one interesting claim seems to show that you can see an increase in complexity as seen by the number of snipping and ripping operations by these crows spreading over New Caledonia, sort of showing the social transmission of these capacities. Third, there's an impressive amount of work now on cetaceans, so whales and dolphins, that demonstrates their capacity to transmit hunting techniques like sponge fishing or bubble nets, and to craft and update songs that distinguish distinct pods that last, in particular, about sperm whales. Some really amazing work. And then finally, there's some work from Sasaki and Bureau on homing pigeons. In a novel experimental design, researchers employed a task with pairs of pigeons where experienced pigeons were gradually replaced by naive ones, and they were sort of tracking a course. Over time, these pairs developed more and more direct routes towards the target. And there thus seems to be something like cumulative improvement in that homing behavior over time. And I'm going to return to that example a little bit later. The second splitting argument has largely attempted to split up evolutionary products, patterns, and products. So if that first argument about animal cognition was meant to say, well, these capacities are too lumped, we need to split them up, there's a number of more abstract arguments saying that the ways in which the concept of cumulative culture has been used tends to lump together processes, patterns, and products. So some of my own work has been involved in challenging this idea that cumulative culture can be identified with products that are too complex for any individual to innovate on their own. And that's because the processes of cumulative culture are compatible with producing patterns and products that are maladaptive, evolutionarily neutral, and simple. The processes of maintenance, transmission, and retention, in other words, aren't a foolproof recipe to get microchips or spaceships. Nonetheless, I think that those complex cumulative cultural products are still useful signals that such cumulative cultural evolution has happened or is ongoing. Second, the capacities of maintenance, transmission, and retention are really likely high-level and abstract sketches of a wide range of cognitive mechanisms that support cumulative cultural change across various domains. Not just this, but splitters have argued that we need to incorporate ways in which the environment is seeded with information. Cast-off tools, organized workspaces, and so on, leak information about cumulative culture into the environment. The general idea here is that we might be, by ignoring environmental scaffolding, overestimating human capacities and underestimating animal ones. If we build in possibilities of different kinds of ways by which traits are maintained, retained, and transmitted over time, what we might expect to find in animals are things like islands of cumulative culture, right, where species can learn cumulatively in some domains and not others. And then third, maybe opening up a can of worms, we need to make room in our account of cumulative culture for an important distinction between open-ended evolution and bounded evolution. That is, between cultural evolution that can produce novel traits and explore a wide range of possibilities, and cultural evolution that's limited to exploring a more restricted repertoire of traits. And I say that's opening up a can of worms. This is in part one thing that's at stake in these recent arguments from Claudio Teni about a zone of latent solutions. Okay, so that was all pretty abstract, but let me try and find some commonalities. So what these splitters are reacting to is the fact that most research on cumulative culture has focused on paradigm cases of cumulative culture. I don't know why that point got cut off. So these paradigm cases are instances of cumulative culture that display incredible complexity, long histories of innovation, and maybe recombination, in which have contributed to the adaptive success of hominins, and particularly human beings. The image here is supposed to be a rough depiction of more or less paradigm cases, with things like microchips following pretty squarely in the center, but with other traits around agriculture, foraging, and even lithic technologies as being pretty sophisticated instances of cumulative cultural change. What the splitters argue, and I myself sort of identify as a splitter, is that if we want to understand how capacities for cumulative culture evolved, to understand the sort of processes involved and the kinds of patterns and products generated, we need to look at more marginal cases of cumulative culture. That is, at instances of cultural products seen in archaic hominins, non-human animals, maybe looking at maladaptive and neutral instances of cumulative change, and perhaps in the minimal capacities needed to produce cumulative culture in animals and artificial systems. So Deep Brain has actually been working on some cumulative cultural models that have been interesting. In general, I think if we really want to know how hominins got to the Rubicon and why they dipped their first toes in, we need to have a clearer and more grounded understanding of the cumulative cultural concept. And I think looking at marginal cases is the way to do this. It's into this sort of developing literature and the sort of free-for-all that's going on that I think something of a bomb has been dropped. So in a series of papers, Nicolas Clédière and in conjunction with the lab of Joël Fagot and several other collaborators have pushed this idea that Guinea baboons have capacities for cumulative culture. Now, this is a contentious and maybe surprising result for a few reasons. The first is that baboons are not normally associated with cumulative culture. And it's not just that. As far as I can tell, there's not only no experimental work prior to these papers that baboon have cultural capacities, but I'm also not really aware of any other anecdotes. And hopefully some of the primatologists here can correct me if that's wrong. But still, experimental detection of cumulative culture would be big news, as you can see by where these publications seem to be placed. The second is that if baboons have proto-capacities for cumulative culture, it would radically upend our narratives of hominin cognitive evolution. At the very least, it would give some people reason to push back narratives around cumulative culture a few million years. So these are claims that are really worth interrogating seriously. When we do these kinds of interrogations, we find that Clédier and colleagues adopt some really interesting novel ways for identifying cumulative cultural patterns and products in baboon activities. One novelty is the use of transmission chain paradigms to detect cumulative cultural processes. So this is just a schematic view of a transmission chain experiment, or at least it will be in just a moment. So these are instances where we have a chain of participants. The first participant's giving a stimulus, typically for a couple seconds, at most maybe a minute. They're then asked to recreate that stimulus, typically by drawing it. And then that first participant's drawing is then passed to the second participant, who may modify it based on the sort of a short period of time at which they're exposed to the stimulus. And it gets passed on and on and on down through the chain until you might end up with something very different from the initial stimulus. What this paradigm typically detects are biases in either learning or expression, leading to the emphasis, organization, or forgetting of various features of the stimulus. A second really interesting novelty of the Clédier papers is precisely how this experimental paradigm could be implemented in monkeys. Maybe I'll just try and play this in the background if it's not going to be too loud. Or maybe I won't. But that's okay, because I've got a picture of the ALDM. This is the automated learning device for monkeys, or ALDM. And it allows for the baboons to enter into the testing environment at any time of their choosing. So they're sort of roaming free in the pen, and they can come into the device. And they can interact with the test apparatus whenever they'd like. And for this, and I think most of the experiments, this is a touch screen, so they'll come in, reach their paw through, and as they do so, they have a radio frequency identification chip implanted in their arm, so it knows which baboon is interacting with the device at any given time. Okay, so what are the experiments at stake? So the tests, or the experiments test spatial memory using this kind of 2D stimuli, this 4x4 array. So baboons are presented with grids of white and colored squares. And in one version of the task, the red squares are the target, and that's the task you see here. And so after a short period of observation, the grid of squares all turn white, and the baboons must touch the previously illuminated red squares. They get a food reward, a couple of wheat berries. In the second version of the task, they're presented with green squares. Then, of course, the white squares pop up, and they're asked to click squares that weren't green previously. So the first task here is the copying task, copying the stimuli. The opposite one with the green, where you're trying not to touch the green ones, is called a non-copying task. To create transmission chains, the experimenters worked with 50 trial test blocks. The first test of each chain involved a randomly generated stimuli. And when the baboon finished such a block, so they do these 50 tests and sequences, that block of 50 trials then gets sent to another baboon. The next participant in the chain, I should say, might be a different baboon. That's what's depicted here in the blue sequence. But as a control, they also sometimes send those block of 50 trials back to the same baboon to get a kind of baseline measure. So when the blocks get transmitted between baboons, that's the between individuals. And when it gets sent back to the same baboon, that's the within individuals condition. In the between individual chains, baboons further down that chain, while they're waiting for these blocks to come along, they could still go into the device, right? They could still go in and interact with the touchscreen, but they would just be given random stimuli to work with. Because the baboons could freely enter, sometimes this meant that baboons did hundreds of trials in between the sort of test blocks. Okay. And this brings us to a third novelty of the paper. So Claydier and colleagues suggest that they find 3 patterns that they take to typify human cumulative culture that they discover in baboons. That's an increase in performance, increase in structure, and lineage specificity. So increase in performance, pretty straightforward, measured by % successful trials. That's here selecting 3 or 4 correct target squares. And this showed an increase in both experimental trials and over generations of experimental trials, unsurprisingly. These monkeys are getting trained up. An increase in structure was measured by the emergence of Tetris-like zoids, what are called tetronomos. And I've highlighted just one chain here, but tetronomos are any shape that are connected by edges. So you can see a few other ones here. All the ones that are colored are different tetronomos. So there's classic L shape, the squares. Basically, any of your familiar Tetris shapes are tetronomos. So they saw these shapes emerging again and again, and that's how they were measuring the emergence of structure. Finally, lineage specificity was detected in terms of the distribution of grids within each chain for the copying task, with notable differences between them. So this is just one block of 50 trials. They have, I think, 6 of these 50 blocks. And in each of them, you see a different distribution of tetronomos in each of these 50 chain blocks. And so this is this idea that each lineage is specific. There's something distinctive about each of them. On the basis of these features, the authors conclude that human beings, quote, shed new light on human uniqueness. We share with our closest relatives essential capacities to produce human-like cultural evolution. In later papers, the claim is amplified further. They make the claim that cumulative culture, quote, is not dependent on special cognitive capacities unique to humans. So this is pretty bold stuff, pretty bold claims. So why am I highlighting these papers by Nico Claydier? Well, as above, I think these results are surprising. They're worth interrogating, and they might carry important implications. But I also think they point to a need for a philosophical project, which is handy for me. This is a project that is, I think, complementary to these splitting efforts mentioned above. So as I said, I'm a splitter. I think that the concept is really just, it's got too many things going on with it. And one thing we need to do is decompose the places where we see the concept being used into constituent elements. But alongside that, we need an approach that identifies distinct and important clusters of cumulative cultural activities. That is, we need to recognize distinct kinds of cumulative culture. So this is more philosophical jargon. I'm using the word kinds in a way that philosophers tend to use it. And the way that we philosophers tend to use it is as a shorthand for recurrent clusters of properties that can be the subject of scientific investigation. So the old slogan for kinds was that they carved nature at its joints. And we see an image of some excellent joint carving here. This is Mendeleev's periodic table, sort of carving the elements in terms of atomic weight and valency. Philosophers are a little bit more circumspect now that we're going to have just one way of carving up the world, that there's going to be likely many equally revealing ways of carving up nature at its joints. But they've kept this term kinds as a way of picking out these clustered properties that science investigates. And so as the abstract suggests, and what I'm going to be arguing here is that there's actually three kinds of cumulative culture that we can identify in the literature today. There might be more, but these are the ones that I find. I use some pretty technical terms in the abstract to sound smart. But this is work in progress, so I'm going to be trying out some, I think, more approachable language here as well. So the three kinds: socially scaffolded task optimization, or just collective optimization; domain parsing and organization, or domain management; and then technological recombination and affordance matching becomes mix and match. As I'll be suggesting in the rest of the talk, I think distinguishing these helps to make sense of what's going on with these baboon experiments, but also, I think, shows a way towards looking at how different kinds of cumulative culture might have sort of interesting potential feedback relationships in human cognitive evolution. And maybe even vindicating some claims about animals having cumulative culture. Okay. So let me begin by talking about collective optimization. And I'll do so by returning to and expanding on this experiment from Sasaki and Barreau that I mentioned earlier. So there, homing pigeons were trained to navigate towards a target. And the explanation for homing pigeons being able to do this is actually really interesting. There's a lot of work on it. Basically, homing pigeons have something like a sense for dead reckoning going towards a particular target, but they also have exceptional episodic memory, recognizing distinct landmarks along the way. Alongside this, and important for the experimental paradigm, birds of a feather like to flock together. They like to fly in social proximity to conspecifics. So Sasaki and Barreau adopted this kind of micro-society paradigm where they'd have pairs of birds flying together. And as I said, they would eventually release and replace the expert pigeon after 12 flights. So over time, over these multiple generations, you see more and more direct routes between the release point and the target point. So that's on your left, with the black being the flight path after 5 generations. Versus in the middle and on the right, what just happens as controls when we release single pigeons or when we release 2 pigeons together. It's a slightly longer flight path with a little bit of wobble to it. So this suggests to Sasaki and Barreau, and indeed to, I think, many people working in the cumulative cultural literature, something like cumulative culture over time. There's something being transmitted. There's some kind of cumulative improvement in this population over time. In useful modeling work, Edwin Dahlmeier, I think, provides a really useful generalized model of the homing pigeon case study to explore the different elements at play. And he describes the capacities at stake as involving this dead reckoning, or goal direction, as he calls it, social proximity, and route memory, which is this ability to recognize landmarks. As Dahlmeier suggests, what's going on here is something like regression to the goal. Mistakes by naive homing pigeons are valuable because they introduce noise into the system, which over time allows for new pigeons to adopt more and more useful and optimal paths. Now, that might sound counterintuitive, but the noise introduced by naive pigeons allows newcomers to disrupt the flight patterns of the more experienced pigeons, with some of these disruptions finding better and more effective landmarks. What's happening here, I suggest, is that the naive pigeon is using the more experienced pigeon as something like a social scaffold to acquire better and better landmarks. So the previous flight paths and the previous landmarks learned by the experienced pigeon scaffold the noisy acquisition of new ones by the naive pigeon. And I think we can apply the same kind of model to other animals that display sorts of socially mediated pathfinding. So the pheromone trails of ants, for instance, seem like they provide a similar kind of socially scaffolded memory trace, albeit one that actually goes to the environment itself. And we might also apply this to more complex means by which optimization takes place. So the philosopher Kim Sterelny famously defended an apprenticeship model where naive learners in a workshop, like a kitchen or woodworking shop, can learn from more experienced agents in ways that scaffolds their acquisition abilities. And I was reminded over lunch that the same kind of apprenticeship learning plausibly describes how chimps learn to crack nuts, right? Just exploring and experimenting around sites where anvil stones and hammer stones are just sort of around, as well as the effects of those hammer and anvil stones, the sort of cast off nuts. So collective optimization is one kind of cumulative cultural evolution where these capacities for acquiring socially accessible or scaffolded memory traces allows for the decomposition of complex goals in ways that successive agents can iteratively improve on them. The second is a kind of cultural evolution I call domain management. This refers to the ways in which cumulative cultural evolution can parcel up informational domains, standardize components, and increase systematic features. So this is the kind of cultural evolution I see in the evolution of language. Over the past 20 years or so, people like Simon Kirby have done really amazing work, largely with artificial languages, showing how communication between agents can lead to languages that are more regular, standardized, systematic, and simple over time. Let me also introduce another powerful modeling approach here. This is recent work by Ben Fallandaise and Paul Smaldino. And so theirs is a novel agent-based modeling approach where each agent has a mixture of Gaussians, basically a stand-in for guesses about optimal traits in the world. These agents are arranged into networks, and where each of them has an opportunity to be the sender and receiver of a signal. Now, this is all pretty complicated. There's a lot of things on the screen. The intuitive explanation is to relate this back to language evolution. So imagine you're thrown into a new environment where you're given entirely new words to communicate with. You come across someone who says the word gavagai in a particular situation, and you think, well, what does that mean? After deciding where it fits, deciding how to categorize it, you update your lexicon not just with information about the circumstances under which that term is used, but also that you don't use other lexical items in the same set of circumstances. So there's more complexities to their model. I think it's just a really amazing model. But what they show is under these very basic assumptions, agents end up dividing the world, or I should say dividing up an informational domain in ways that aren't quite optimal, but have this sort of fuzzy optimization. But they also create these stable and iterable distribution of classified signals. To keep the language example going, we might think of this space in terms of like a lexicon or a semantic space, and this parceling up as maximizing differences in ways that aid discrimination and perhaps becoming a basis for regularization and systematization. So these kinds of models display cumulative cultural evolutionary patterns that are quite distinct from the first kind. To the extent that there's optimization here, it's optimizing the quality of informational signals in a domain, as well as allowing for the regularization and maybe systematicity of that domain. The last kind of cumulative culture is one I'm not going to spend too much time on, in part because it's so familiar. It's the kind of cumulative culture that most paradigmatic researchers study, which is the increase of technological complexity and sophistication that has captured the attention of much cultural evolutionary research. In fact, I'm actually going to skip over most of this together. Suffice to say, one of the things that's so interesting and compelling about human technology and cumulative cultural change is the way in which it seems to recombine elements in ways that opens up new possibilities for technological application. And I tend to construe this in terms of combining affordances and finding ways in which those affordances apply to different circumstances. But I'm happy to say more about that in the Q&A. So I've just provided some very impressionistic sketches, but what I hope to have done is provide at least an intuitive way in which we might distinguish these three different kinds of cumulative culture. I've left open capacities, patterns, products. These are details that I think need to be filled in. Nonetheless, I think we have enough resources with these distinguished to return to the Clédière papers and maybe downplay some of the radical implications that they're suggesting. So let's go back to these baboon papers really briefly, and I'll be upfront. So my interpretation of Clédière and colleagues' paper is that they're trying to make the claim that humans have the basic capacities for something like domain management, this kind of capacity to manage an informational domain, creating stable symbols that might then, attach meaning to. You might get the early basics of language evolution. And I'm pretty skeptical about this, in part because of some known constraints about baboon psychology. So consider first, baboons don't seem to attend to global properties of 2D item arrays. So if we look at that top left image, we've got circles, squares, diamonds, and X's made up of smaller things. Circles, squares, diamonds, and X's. And baboons don't discriminate those global properties. They perform just barely better than chance at discriminating them. But they can discriminate the smaller component pieces, even when they're organized into those arrays. Connecting them together with lines doesn't help. Even if you connect these things together, the baboons don't really discriminate those images, but they can still discriminate those smaller component bits. The emphasis on local perceptual tracking means that baboons are less subject to illusions of relative size. So hopefully this is an illusion that you all recognize. So this is the Ebbinghaus illusion, where the circle on the right looks much bigger than the one on the left. But as we all know with illusions, things that look different are the same, things that look same are different. And that's the case here. The circles, the orange circles in the center are the same size. Relatedly, a study on macaques, and it's important to know, I'm not trying to fool anyone, this is about macaques and not baboons. They can't detect relational structures. And more generally, their spatial accuracy on such spatial memory tasks is really low as compared to humans. So all of this suggests to me that effects driving the emergence and persistence of those Tetris-like shapes might have little to do with something like a preference or even a sensitivity to the kinds of shapes or configurations among these stimuli. They just don't seem to track that information. More generally, it seems like we can explain the emergence of these shapes by some other well-known limitations on baboon spatial and sequential processing. Crucial among these is sensitivity to the path length, so literally the Euclidean distance between stimuli. This causes baboons to, the longer path length has almost a linear relationship to reaction time. And so this suggests that task items that are more spatially dispersed will require longer processing, and that errors that decrease them make processing, remembering, and touching easier. Combine this with processes of introducing error, just being pretty lazy, tapping the screen. I think you're going to see things like those Tetris-like shapes emerging just by a sheer result of errors. So in other words, I think we should expect these kinds of tetronomos, these Tetris-like shapes, to emerge in any case over trials. Errors and laziness are going to increase they're going to increasingly group those individual stimuli into these clusters. And these are easier for baboons to individually remember and produce due to these path length constraints. I'll skip over some elements about why I think this can explain the lineage effects. Suffice to say, I think, because it's about errors are pretty contingent. They'll differ from trial to trial. we should expect that different lineages will have different clusterings of these tetronomos. But let me get to some punchlines. So I'm going to start by returning to the idea that the baboons in the experiments are doing something like domain management. And in fact, what I think is going on is that what these baboons are doing is something more like collective optimization, right? They're in this highly structured, scaffolded environment where that simplistic array is acting like an external memory trace. And I think it's very much akin to the kind of pheromone trail of ants or the homing behavior of pigeons. So the overall claim then is that these baboon results should be understood not as evidence of domain management, this idea that they're parceling up an informational domain in maybe an intelligent way, but as collective optimization, right? And that environment, the ALDM, is acting as a scaffold for apes to optimize basically processing, basically their task performance. So even if this is a somewhat deflationary argument, right? I don't think that these baboons and these results show that there's something that needs to be changed in our narratives of hominin evolution. I think what they have shown is this utility of distinguishing distinct kinds of cumulative culture. These kinds are both conceptually and I hope empirically distinct. We can certainly distinguish them in models. So they're distinct, even if these underlying capacities, processes, patterns, and products are likely to overlap in lots of cases, especially with humans, right? The interactions between language, the interactions between language and technology are really powerful. Because of this, I think we can rest easy. Standard narratives around human cognitive evolution seem pretty secure. So these standard narratives identify co-evolutionary feedback loops between tool use, mutualistic foraging, and increased group sizes to explain an increase in capacities for technological sophistication, executive control, and eventually something like division of labor in the Pleistocene. Nonetheless, it's wrong to think that these kinds of cumulative culture don't have important things to say to one another. Something that I think has been lacking in a lot of recent work on cultural evolution is useful back and forth between these different literatures, between literatures on language evolution, technological, cumulative culture, and comparative cognition. There's some work in this area. So Kim Storelny, who I mentioned previously, has a book on the evolution of language with his postdoc, Ron Planer. But I think there's much more work to be done. And now I look forward to hearing from you about what more work needs to be done. Thank you.